on nature and will be chaired by Dr. Tim Foster, who is the Director of Manchester Environmental Research Institute. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. So much like the other panels, we're going to have a sequence of 3 presentations, and then we will have a panel discussion at the end of that. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Sarah Sutcliffe, who's a postdoc in the Global Development Institute, going to be talking to us a bit about the social impacts of Earth observation in conservation.
Great. Hi everyone. As Tim just said, I'm a postdoc in the GDI, and I'll just get through that. As I'm sure most of you are at least tangentially aware, in the last decade or so there's been a rapid expansion in the amount of geospatial information that's available, and it's been increasingly used in conservation and sustainability research and practice. However, social science research on the implications of this use of data has been vastly outpaced by the rate of technological transformation. There's a number of different technologies which kind of fall under this category of Earth observation. So this is generally things that are sensors in space or in the sky, so things like cameras, radar, LiDAR mounted on aircraft, drones and satellites. And the data sets that are produced through these technologies can be used for anything from habitat mapping to modelling ecological parameters to even tracking actual individual animals in real time from space, if you've got sufficiently high resolution. Clearly, there's a lot of potential benefits of this abundance of data for conservation, sustainability, research and monitoring. But if remote sensing is the future of conservation, important questions still remain about who is shaping and being shaped by this future. For example, who's able to access and make use of this technology and data, and how decisions informed by this data are influencing the lives of people who are living within conservation landscapes. So often remotely sensed geospatial data is perceived as neutral or unbiased, and in turn, decisions based on those data are perceived as objective, meaning that there's no perceived drawbacks to their increased use in conservation decision-making. However, as this quote from a recent paper by some of my colleagues involved in this project highlight, this objectivity is something of an illusion, as data, conservation data included, are never neutral because they are derived and used by people. So a data set might be a relatively accurate representation of a particular environmental issue, so it might show fire frequency or species distribution, but the things that are deemed worthy of collecting data about and the decisions that are made based on that data is shaped by different sets of interests and beliefs about what is and isn't important. And so this leads to a number of different ethical issues and justice issues which have been raised by critical data scholars and other related fields. For example, people living in conservation landscapes have a right to privacy. And in particular, there are ethical questions around the inherent power imbalances of who controls and accesses what is ultimately surveillance data. Earth observation can be used to facilitate and legitimize militarized or even violent interventions and enforcement activities, often in deeply socially inequitable contexts. There are ongoing debates around the ethics of dual-use technologies. That is, satellites and drones are fundamentally technologies which were developed for and continue to be used primarily for military purposes. And in many cases, the potential environmental applications of these technologies are happy byproducts. For many people, Earth observation data can't be separated from the violent context in which it was developed. One of the major benefits of remote sensing data is that we can collect huge amounts of environmental data in near real time, even from the most remote locations. However, this comes with drawbacks in that conservation actors, data producers, and data analysts can be collecting data and making decisions based on that data without ever going to the place that that data is about, and without having any knowledge of the social context, historical context, economic context of that place, and without either engaging with or consulting with or even asking the permission of the people who are living and working and dependent on that landscape. There's also a field of Indigenous data sovereignty, which is increasingly calling for Indigenous people and local communities to actually have control, not just access, of these kinds of data, rather than it being held by external, often colonial governments and private actors. And there are also practical and ethical questions around the amount of energy and resource that is required to produce and store all of this data, which is really relevant in the midst of a climate crisis, which is having a disproportionate impact on marginalised communities in the global south. But it's not all bad news. This data can also be used really positively. So, for example, both drones and satellite imagery products are being used as evidence by Indigenous people and local communities to demonstrate the effectiveness of local stewardship practices, reassert traditional rights, and resist spatial encroachment. So, for example, community groups in Guatemala are using Earth observation data to prove that their land management practices are more effective in preventing and limiting wildfires than in areas of the same reserve which are managed by contemporary Western conservation practices. So I don't want you to get the idea that Earth observation data is all terrible and we should never use it. We just need to make sure that, like any tool, when we use it, we're considering the potential pros and cons of it and making sure that the decisions about when and how to use it take into account the perspectives and, in fact, prioritise the perspectives of people living in the landscapes that this data is capturing. And that's what we're trying to do with the Just Earth Observation for Conservation project, which is a 5-year, $2.5 million ESRC-funded project motivated by the following research questions. Firstly, what are the structures of Earth observation datascapes which are associated with different conservation landscapes around the world? Who produces, analyses, and uses that data? In what ways and why? And why do different landscape structures emerge in different places? Secondly, what are the lived consequences of current datascape structures in conservation landscapes? And what ways are these perceived as just or unjust by different actors? Thirdly, how do residents of conservation landscapes and other conservation actors envision more just Earth observation datascapes of the future? And do these visions reflect different conceptions of what justice is? And finally, what interventions in how Earth observation data is generated, analysed, governed and used can mitigate the risks of injustice and advance just data practices which enable socially just conservation? So I used the term datascape a fair bit there when I was going through those questions, and this is a term that we invented. Essentially, it means the networks of people and organisations, data sets, and data-justified decisions that shape a particular place. So this project is led by PI's Rose Pritchard and Tim, over there, you might recognise him. But we have a large and talented team of researchers, including people from each of our case study sites. And the relationships that those people have in those communities is what has really allowed us to make this a co-produced project. So those study sites are the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala, the Peak District National Park right next door to us here, the Albufera National Park in Spain, and the Mount Kenya region in Kenya. So in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala, Earth observation is being used by a really diverse range of users. Like I mentioned earlier, there are community-based organisations who are leveraging Earth observation towards gains in land and resource rights. And one of the things that makes this an interesting example is that multiple groups with conflicting perspectives about what constitutes proper land management are all using Earth observation to support their arguments, which demonstrates that it's not as simple as you might think to use Earth observation data to prove what objective best practice is. In the Albufera in Spain, Earth observation data is used for water quality monitoring in the Albufera lagoon and in the regulation of agricultural activities in the connected Huga River Basin, and it's been used extensively in disaster response monitoring and reporting following on the floods that happened late last year. Here in the Peak District, Earth observation data is used extensively for land cover and habitat mapping, monitoring of things like fire and landscape restoration projects, particularly in relation to peatlands, and in new representations of the Peak District in advocacy materials and via social media. In the landscape around Mount Kenya, satellite imagery is being used to monitor habitats and migration corridors for endangered wildlife, map the spread of invasive species, and drone footage is being used extensively by environmental groups to raise awareness and fundraise for environmental projects. For example, you may have seen ads for Just Dig It on billboards and in movie theatres here in the UK. So, because the whole point of this project is about understanding how to practically make use of remote sensing technology and data in conservation landscapes more just and equitable for the people in those landscapes, knowledge co-production alongside those people is a core principle of the project design. So there's 5 main ways we've incorporated co-production into our design from the start. Firstly, our landscape leads and landscape teams are primarily made up of local academics with long-standing collaborative relationships in those landscapes, and those relationships are what allowed us to develop and continue to produce work that is locally relevant. We have partner organisations in each landscape, including government agencies, NGOs, and local academic organisations who are acting as advisors and collaborators from project ideation onwards. At each phase of the project, so like 3 or 4 times throughout the duration of the project, in each of the landscapes, we're hosting stakeholder workshops, which are partially a data collection opportunity, but more importantly, they're an opportunity for building on those partnerships and relationships between us and local stakeholders, but also amongst local stakeholders, and allowing them to engage in the process of planning the next steps and the outputs from our project. While we have a general idea of what we think the project is going to look like over the 5 years, as is required when you're applying for funding, we have specifically designed the project so that the later stages of what we're doing will be really heavily informed by the earlier stages of the project, and particularly the kinds of outputs that we're hoping to produce will be dictated by what people want and need. And finally, built into our project is funding and support for a number of partner-led student research projects. So various different partner organisations in the landscape will have the opportunity to propose research questions which are related to this research topic, and then we'll provide funding and support for students from local universities that we've partnered with to work with those organisations to do that place-based research. So our project has sort of a 3-phase structure. Firstly, we're trying to reveal what local Earth observation datascapes are in each place, understanding how these data are used by what actors and with what justice implications. We're then trying to reimagine the Earth observation datascape in each place and working with those who are using and impacted by Earth observation data to imagine alternative datascapes in which good practices are expanded and the risks of potential injustices are mitigated. And finally, we'll be looking to develop practical actions, develop capacity and responses which can expand on the good practices and seek to remedy the injustices that we identify in earlier project phases. So we're currently in the midst of phase 1 of the project, revealing datascapes, and there's sort of 4 parts to this, with the general idea that we would start with secondary sources to get an overview of uses in each site, and then start engaging with stakeholders through meetings and that joint workshop in each site that I mentioned, to identify the challenges and emerging solutions around just use of Earth observation in each landscape, so that they can deliberate on what things within the broader topics that we've identified are actually important priorities to focus on in each landscape in the next phase, and identify specific research questions and practical outputs that they'd like to see addressed in phase 2. So in most of the sites, we're currently still in the early literature review and stakeholder engagement phase, but we have largely completed this work in Kenya, culminating in our first workshop back in April. So I'm just going to share some of the key findings and takeaways from that workshop to show how we'll be using the work from that first phase to shape the rest of the research moving forward. Oops. Sorry, formatting issue there. So a key part of this workshop was discussing some of the challenges and solutions that actors in the landscape have already been facing and are trying to implement. And so the main area of challenge that is currently being experienced is around issues with data access, particularly with the cost of really high resolution privately collected data, and issues around the skills and technology that is required to utilise and implement that data into their management practices. They also talked about issues around data sovereignty and gaining informed consent to collect and use remote sense data from Indigenous people and local community groups. Satellites are already in the sky, they're already collecting the data, it's easy to just analyse it without talking to anyone, but that's not great practice. There's also challenges around how to best integrate traditional ecological knowledge and cultural social data alongside digital observation data. There's issues with transparency, standardization, bureaucracy, duplication of effort with a lot of people doing the same thing with very similar data, and biases around what data is being collected, with a particular prioritization on quantitative data and your frequent issue with people caring more about elephants than anything else. And issues around communication and tech literacy issues, particularly when trying to work with communities, and conflicting narratives. So just because something looks pretty and green in a photo doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually delivering essential ecosystem services. But these people are already coming up with solutions. So there's things that they want to engage in more, for example, data sharing, opportunities for collaboration, creating things like a central data hub where people can access data that's being used by other people in the landscape, trying to increase the availability of open access data, and finding ways for actors who currently don't have access to get funding or other ways of accessing data which currently is behind paywalls. As well as the opportunities for training, capacity building, and raising awareness amongst both staffs of conservation organisations and communities, and trying to increase data sharing and control with communities, as well as the need for increased ground truthing and validation, participatory mapping, co-production, and the integration of multiple data types. So this workshop was not just an opportunity for us to document these things, but also to shape the next phase of our project. And so the findings from this workshop really refocus what we thought was going to be the most important things that we were going to be discussing in the next phase. So while there was some discussion of ethics, privacy and consent in relation to Indigenous data ownership and control, there are a lot more issues raised around practical and equitable data access, which were definitely the priority for most of the people there. However, this could be a factor that a lot of the people at the workshop were conservation actors rather than community members, so definitely when we engage with them moving forward in the next phase of the project, those priorities might shift. We also worked with project attendees to brainstorm suggested outputs for the next phase of the project, which would be most helpful to them, and so that includes things like a shareable index of Earth observation data sets that various actors in the landscape are currently using, so people who want to then use Earth observation in the future can see who else is already working on that, maybe find a way to coordinate with them, learn from them, to reduce some of the duplication of effort in purchasing and then processing data that's currently happening. And we also talked about facilitating connectivity and learning opportunities across different landscapes, and also integration and communication with people higher up in the value chain so that the data products being produced are actually fit for purpose in the landscape. And this workshop was also a really great way for us to learn from actors who shared their knowledge and experience of the best ways to engage local communities in discussions around technology and data. And this has really influenced our methodology that we're going to be looking to implement in phase 2 of the project. And we're hoping to actually work directly with some of the people who are already doing really great work engaging with communities about data in the context of conservation over the coming months. And also we use this as an opportunity to start brainstorming and building momentum towards student projects for the next phase. So the main challenge that we've had in trying to take a co-development approach to this work is that while this is one project, we're working across 4 different countries with lots of different actors and lots of different ideas. While the benefit of co-production is that our findings will hopefully be more attuned to local issues and our outputs will be more targeted and helpful for our partners, it's challenging to balance customizing our approach and the outputs that we make with the need to also produce cross-comparable academic outputs across the 4 sites, which requires at least some consistency in the methodology that we're using and the way that we're conceptualizing core themes within the work. It's surprising how much variation there can be when you ask different people in 4 different countries just to define justice, Earth observation, and conservation. Secondly, similar to what some of our earlier speakers have said, unfortunately, as much as we would like to engage with various different actors at every single phase of this project, our partners are time poor, resource poor, and while a lot of them have said, yeah, this is really interesting research, we want to be involved, we want to make sure that our Earth observation practices are best practice, they just don't have the time to engage as extensively as they would like to or we would like to. So we are having to sort of prioritise when and where we're engaging with them to make sure that we're not wasting their time, but also still producing really valuable research. And I really look forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers about whether or not they face similar challenges and how they're overcoming them. If you would like to follow along with the project as it continues, we have a LinkedIn group, and I will hand over now. Thank
you. Thanks, Sarah.
Is that okay? That's it, great. So, thanks very much for asking me to talk this afternoon. Delighted to be here to talk about our work. This is a project that's been going on for a number of years, about riverbed microplastics, principally around the rivers of Greater Manchester, but elsewhere as well. and the sewage scandal. Rather a startling title, but hopefully I'll be able to show the link between those two things. We've been doing a lot of work on microplastics in the rivers around Manchester over the last decade or so. There's an emerging body of work now showing that we should be concerned about microplastics in the environment from an ecological point of view, but also increasingly from potential impacts on human health, some of which are listed there. Greater risk of heart disease, for example, and stroke with people who've got microplastics in coronary arteries. Interesting data about microplastics now is spreading superbugs from sewage to the sea. Now, something remarkable happened just a couple of years ago, in middle of May 2023. The private water companies in England apologised for sewage spills, for sort of large-scale, industrial-scale dumping of sewage in many of our rivers, lakes and coastal waters. And encouragingly, that initiated what they called a massive transformation programme. Huge amounts of investment are now going into remedying the problem to reduce the amount of sewage. And I'll be talking about that and how it links to the microplastics issue. Now, we live in the northwest. This is the great River Irwell, which flows through the city of Manchester, the city of Salford. An analysis by The Guardian using United Utilities' own data in 2024 for the 2023 data showed the rivers in the north of England are bearing the brunt of the sewage pollution crisis. So this is something we should all be concerned about. Analysis by The Guardian reveals with the region's waters experience the highest rates of wastewater discharge in the country. And if you take the River Irwell catchment, storm overflows around the Irwell Valley, where the Crowle and the Irwell run through to Manchester. Raw sewage was discharged 12,000 times, that's the number of spills in 2023, and by mile of catchment, it was the highest rate anywhere in England and Wales. And the government has a sewage reduction plan. The water companies have now been set a target to reduce sewage spills by 50%, the number of spills by 2030, based on a 2024 baseline. So if we're serious about ecological restoration, if we're serious about restoring ecological habitats in our rivers, that's a key priority. That's something that has to happen. Because now there's been a lot of stories. This is just one in the Manchester News. There's been a lot of press about the sewage problem around Manchester. This is from February this year, focusing on the Irwell. The government's just banned wet wipes containing plastic, which is a good thing. But sewage discharges degrade precious riverine ecosystems in a number of ways. They also litter riverbanks and beds, and they pose a real and present danger to public health. So there's been a lot of publicity, a lot of media coverage, a lot of coverage about the sewage scandal with the election into summer of 2024. So there are big objectives now to try and tackle this problem. An interesting thing about this problem is that revealing the sewage scandal has actually been not really by the regulator, the Environment Agency, who are responsible for doing that, or Ofwat. It's basically been activists and campaign groups around the country. And this is a triumph for people, actually. We've all heard of Fergal Sharkey, but Jenny Jones here, one of the two Green peers in the House of Lords. Lots of groups, the Ilkley Clean Rivers Group, the Windrush Against Sewage Pollution Group have done fabulous work flagging up this issue. So, what have we been doing in Manchester? Now, we've been focusing on the concentration of microplastics on riverbeds. They're stored on the riverbeds. And this is the River Tame to the east of Manchester. Just to let you know how we collect our samples. We use a metal cylinder, we push it into the riverbed to isolate a portion of the bed. We disturb the gravels and the sands so they're clear here on the left. They become agitated there and turbid. We take large volumes of muddy water back to the laboratory, so the fine sediments and any microplastics come into suspension. We remove them from the muddy water, and then we identify them and we count them. And so those are microplastics that are on the riverbed. And in 2015, we sampled 40 sites around Greater Manchester on the River Irwell catchment to the north and all the tributaries, and the Upper Mersey to the south. And apart from one site here in Derbyshire on the River Goyt down there, we found microplastics at every location. So, key thing to remember there is we've got microplastic fragments which look like this. I've got a very good, you can see the pink fragments here. They're shown in pink on the pie chart. The green shows the circular microbeads. They're industrial microbeads, and the orange is microplastic fibres. So we find mixes of microplastic assemblages, and in some places there, in 5 locations, we had what we called microplastic hotspots, where we have microplastics greater than 15,000 microplastic particles per kilogram of fine bed sediment. So we express the number of microplastics relative to the weight of the mass of the fine bed sediment that we recover. So we found microplastics everywhere, pretty much. In some places we find very high concentrations of microplastics, and we find mixed microplastics assemblages, sometimes dominated by fragments, sometimes 50-50 fragments microbeads, other times dominated by microbeads. So we have mixtures of microplastics, and that relates to the composition of the wastewater very often coming into the sites of those locations. So we're talking about ecology in this session this afternoon. Why does this matter? Well, when microplastics are stored on the riverbed is a key habitat, it's a key zone of intense biological activity where many creatures feed, many creatures live, many creatures reproduce. So if you forage on the riverbed and the riverbed is contaminated with microplastics, there's a much greater chance that those microplastics are going to be ingested, they're going to make their way into the food chain. So microplastics on the riverbed are critical. Many surveys of microplastics in rivers focus on water. They focus on the water column. If you don't include the riverbed, you're going to miss most of the action because the concentrations on the riverbed tend to be much, much higher than you find in the water, certainly in British rivers. So, in the winter of 15-16, we had extensive flooding across the region, particularly in the north. We had a big flood on Boxing Day, biggest flood recorded on the Irwell up to that point. A modest flood to the south of the city. And you'll notice that we resampled them. This was with a PhD student of mine, Rachel Hurley, and colleague James Rothwell. We resampled all those sites in the spring of 2016, and you'll see the vast majority of those pie charts, the circles have got smaller. So we discovered then the process that the microplastics will get washed away during even moderate-sized flood events. You don't need a big flood to do that. So many of those sites were reduced by an order of magnitude. So the good news is the rivers will clean themselves. But the bad news is those microplastics ultimately will end up in the ocean. This big green ball on the right-hand side became known as the Denton hotspot. That was also washed away, but it was created again very quickly within a matter of weeks. So these hotspots are transient, and these hotspots can form very, very quickly. That hotspot was 50-50 fragments, microbeads in 2015. Early 2016, it was 98% microbeads. So that had to be washed away and recreated very quickly. So we showed that floods will flush the microplastics downstream, and I'll come back to that. We published work in Nature Geoscience in 2018. It's Rachel Hurley and James Rothwell. And this paper had significant impact, and there's been a huge amount of work now on microplastics in rivers after this point. Prior to this, most of the work had focused on estuarine and marine environments, and we recognise now that rivers are really important. But it generated a whole series of questions, and we started to think about processes, and we started to think about microplastic sources. How do microplastics get into the river? How do the riverbeds become heavily contaminated with mixed assemblages of microplastics? And from the 2018 paper, we know that when we have decent floods, the microplastics get washed away. But if microplastics are readily transported under high flows, how do riverbeds become so heavily contaminated in the first place? That was a key question we set ourselves. So microplastics come from a whole range of sources, including road runoff, particularly from brake dust and fragments of tyres, domestic wastewater. Geography professors washing their fleeces produces millions of microplastic fibres that end up in domestic wastewater. Also lots of trade effluents, industrial sources, recycling plants, lots of products produce microplastics. So it's well known, there's a huge literature, it's not very exciting literature, but there's a big engineering literature that shows wastewater is full of microplastics of all different types. So we treat wastewater so that nice clean blue water is returned to our rivers to maintain good ecological status. In England at the moment, I think only 14 or 15% of our rivers have good ecological status. The state of our rivers is not a good news story at the moment. So we now know that a lot of untreated wastewater, which is not just sewage, it also includes microplastics and forever chemicals and heavy metals and antibiotics, all sorts of things in wastewater. It's a cocktail of nasties, are often discharged routinely into our rivers without any treatment at all. Now, water companies are only supposed to discharge untreated wastewater during exceptional conditions. And we know that those exceptional conditions, i.e. heavy rainfall and a flood, washes microplastics away. So we started thinking about how do riverbeds become contaminated in the first place. We've just looked at some data for 2023. It's well known and it's well established now from the water company's own monitoring data that huge volumes of untreated wastewater are discharged into our rivers and lakes and coasts. And these data for 2023, United Utilities is our region, a serial offender, huge amounts of wastewater discharged into our rivers. Okay, we'll leave it at that. But what does that mean? The microplastics then tell us, we know conventional wastewater treatment can remove 95 to 99% of microplastic particles. Microplastic particles are suspended solids, and water companies are obliged to remove those from wastewater. So what we found with this work, the presence of microplastic particles on riverbeds, particularly when you've got microbeads, for example, which are primary microplastic particles, they can't form in the river channel. They don't break down from larger plastic items. They're an incontrovertible link with the wastewater system. So the presence of microplastic particles on riverbeds in high concentrations and mixed assemblages tells us that wastewater treatment is not taking place as it should. So, what isn't helping either, I've got some good news at the end, and I've got some good things to say about United Utilities at the end, but what also isn't good is a lot of the misinformation out there. Now, we contributed to a documentary with Paul Whitehouse in 2023 on BBC, and this was a quote from United Utilities: "Wastewater systems are not designed to treat plastics or microplastics. We are working hard with customers and regulators to minimise the amount of plastic ending up in our sewers." Absolutely, we have to reduce the amount of plastic waste we all produce. But wastewater treatment has to be a key part of the strategy we use to keep our rivers clean. So, in 2023, United Utilities was saying that their wastewater treatment systems aren't designed to remove microplastics. Yet when they gave evidence to Parliament in 2021, they were saying, whilst evidence shows a widespread accumulation of plastics in water bodies, treatment processes have been shown to achieve high removal rates of microplastics from drinking water and treated wastewater, up to 99.8%. So in 2021, they could remove microplastics. In 2023, they decided it wasn't their objective. But we can argue about that. There's misinformation out there that changed the strategy. But wastewater treatment has to be a key part of the process, and it has to be done properly. So we did detailed work on the River Tame, 2019, 2020, and showed that the more we look, the more we sample, the more hotspots we find. And we found that the river water in the summertime at low flow and treated wastewater, the orange is basically microplastic fibres at very low concentrations. Fibres are microplastics that can escape the treatment process because they're exceptionally buoyant. So we found low concentrations of microplastic fibres in treated wastewater. Now, at the same locations on the riverbed, we found very, very high concentrations, in some places what we called ultra-contaminated hotspots, downstream of wastewater treatment works, with lots of microbeads, lots of fibres, lots of fragments. So the riverbeds were becoming very heavily contaminated. So we published this in Nature Sustainability in 2021, quite a provocative title. Here we show how untreated wastewater laced with microplastics and raw sewage is routinely discharged into UK river flows that are too low to disperse the microplastics downstream. And you might remember in 2021, that was when the sewage scandal broke. And the Environment Act from Boris Johnson's government went through Parliament in the autumn. And there was a big debate about how severe the penalty should be for sewage dumping in rivers, etc., etc. But this paper provided much impetus to that scandal at that time. And putting this out into the open. So, later study by the BBC data analysis team looking at data from various water companies showed what we call, they said water firms have been illegally spilling sewage on dry days. Now that is illegal, what we call dry weather spills. The microplastics indirectly showed that wastewater must be being discharged when the rivers are at low flow. And this was analysis of data from comparing data with river runoff and weather at various places around the country, showing that there's lots of evidence for many evidence for dry spills. So 3,500 hours in 2022, for example. And one of the problems here is that is getting data from many of the water companies, is because they're currently under investigation by the Environment Agency and not releasing a lot of the data. So this work got a lot of media attention over the last few years because it created a lot of interest because it links the sewage scandal with the microplastic problem. In many ways, they're one and the same thing. So treating the wastewater is really very important. The ultimate solution, of course, is not producing plastic waste, but that isn't going to happen anytime soon. So in terms of the impact of this research, when the Environment Bill went through Parliament 2021. I'll just play the Earl of Caithness, who's my favourite peer in the House of Lords, commented on our research. I'll just play this.
My Lord, first of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for bringing forward the amendments he has and for his commitment to review Schedule 3. That was something that I asked for in committee, and I'm delighted that he's going to do that. The new point that I want to ask is, has he been briefed on the latest research from the University of Manchester that has demonstrated a direct link between poor wastewater management and high levels of microplastic pollution in the United Kingdom? What is clearly happening is when we have these overflows, the microplastics are going out into the water system, and not into the rivers but into the sea. So we're actually negating a whole lot of good that the government have been trying to do in reducing microplastics. So we're just making, if this was not a bad situation before, my lords, it is now a really...
Indeed. So, the challenge, this is Greater Manchester. All these are sites, this is the United Utilities' own monitoring data. All these sites, all the sites there, the brown circles, show where untreated wastewater was discharged into rivers in our region in 2024. The annual data are published at the end of March. That's National Sewage Day for the previous year. So these were published at the end of March 2025. These are all the locations. Now, this is a huge challenge because we have a very high concentration of combined sewer overflows and wastewater treatment plants, but we're also a long way from the sea. Our rivers are quite small in Greater Manchester, the Tame, the Irk, the Roch. They have fairly modest discharges, and yet we have 2.5 million people, lots of industry in this area. If we're serious about ecological restoration, we need to reduce the amount of wastewater, untreated wastewater we're dumping in these rivers, because the rivers are quite modest, they're quite small scale, and they don't have the capacity to absorb the amount of pollutants that we're putting in them at present. This is just one example here on the River Irwell. This was discharged in 2024 for 1,351 hours. Now that isn't exceptional conditions, that is routine, and that's what we need to avoid. The good news is United Utilities are now engaging in what is called a transformation programme, lots of investment, particularly on the River Tame here. Some of the wastewater treatment plants at Duckenfield, Ashland-under-Lyne and Hyde, which have been really poor spillers in the recent past, will be upgraded, and that's positive and that's important. And similar investments going into the River Irwell, and we want to see the results of that. But even if the targets are reducing the spills by 50%, we're still going to have huge volumes of untreated wastewater coming into our small Manchester rivers over the coming decades. It's an ongoing challenge. So, finish on some positive notes. This is Philip Dunn, who was the chair of the Environment Audit Committee in the last Conservative government. He was a big campaigner against sewage pollution in rivers, and it was a very positive influence. His committee published a report in January 2022 on the water quality in rivers. We gave evidence to that report. We did field demonstrations to show them how we collect our samples. And as part of that report, they recommended that the Environment Agency must extend the number of substances it regularly monitors in rivers. The data currently being collected does not provide a comprehensive picture of risks to human health, aquatic life, or microplastic contamination. So a really strong recommendation in that report is that we need a national survey of microplastic contamination. And that should include sampling of riverbeds, because the riverbeds are a key part of the story. If you don't sample the riverbeds, you're not going to fully understand what the hazards or the potential risks are for the ecological status of a river system. And in May 2023, this is Richard Standerwick, who was tasked by the Environment Agency to lead their project to develop a national monitoring strategy for microplastic contamination. Hasn't been implemented yet, but that's something that they're still working on with DEFRA, but it will include sampling of riverbeds. So, just a couple of conclusions. Mapping helps us to estimate the ecological risk from microplastics and provide clues about microplastic sources and how we might shut them down. And I would argue as a physical geographer, a geographical perspective is fundamental to understanding and tackling this problem. Finally, we're talking about the co-production of research. I want to acknowledge and thank colleagues in geography and various PhD students and master students over the last few years who have made huge contributions, and our really important laboratory team at Manchester, the technical staff at Manchester Geography, who've helped us with this research. Thank you.
So welcome everyone and thank you for joining this session. So I'm Dr. Jenna Ashton. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Heritage Studies in the Institute for Cultural Practices in the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures. And I'm also the Programme Director for a Masters in Global Heritage Management. So, titled From Biodiversity to Zoopolis in Community Land Care and Design, my talk is about reimagining how we care for land and design spaces, not just for humans, but for all living beings. This proposition emerges as part of my wider arts and design-led research on community cultural practices, place and justice. During a decade of research collaborations, residents have expressed clear concerns for animals' lives in urban development and regeneration. So I'm further exploring how we better prioritise this issue within critical heritage studies, theory and praxis. So this talk forms part of my thinking for a wider project I'm undertaking called Whose Heritage? An Animal Turn for Heritage Studies, Conservation and Management. So first, a bit more background to this idea of an animal turn for heritage studies. Sociologist and cultural theorist Stuart Hall published his article, Whose Heritage? Unsettling the Heritage, Reimagining the Post-Nation, in the Cultural Journal Third Text in 1999. To quote from Ashley and Stone's book on this key text by Hall, they state, open quote, Hall identified the need to unsettle ideas of British heritage from its elitist conception as white English middle-class concern. He argued that heritage was a discursive practice, not a fixed entity, shaped by cultural and political interests and expressed through a myriad of means in the arts, popular culture, media and heritage institutions. Rethinking national heritage meant broadening both the representation of heritage and the practices of heritage to embed other heritages and recognition of the deep importance of the breadth and depth of UK's social fabric, close quote. So Hall's critique of heritage has expanded into what we now know as the core arguments of a critical heritage studies, focusing on the power dynamics, politics, and ideologies embedded within conceptualisations and management of heritage. Heritage is a social discourse and practice, a verb, not a noun. Extending Stuart Hall's Whose Heritage critique to animals helps us see heritage as a discursive practice shaped by multi-species relations. It invites us to imagine civic systems where animals are not marginal but integral, where designing with animals becomes a form of justice. I've also been leaning into wider multi-species scholarship, including animal geographies, anthrozoology, and critical animal studies to expand these conceptualisations of the animal turn for my field. Our cities and landscapes are under immense pressure from climate change, ecological collapse, and social inequities. If heritage management and spatial design are concerned with expressing what we value, then surely we must include the lives and stories and cultural practices of animals who share these spaces with us. Traditionally, biodiversity has been understood as a metric, a way to count species and measure ecological health. Biodiversity refers to the variety of life forms within ecosystems. It is often treated as a technical measure, species richness, genetic diversity, ecosystem resilience. While useful and important, this framing can be narrow and instrumental. It often reduces life to numbers and overlooks ethical and political dimensions. Zoopolis, a concept first developed by Jennifer Walsh and deepened by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker, invites us to think differently. Zoopolis is a political theory that argues for animal citizenship. It frames animals as co-citizens with rights and interests and responsibilities, not as passive resources and part of ecosystem services. Zoopolis is fundamentally about co-creation, imagining futures where humans and animals share civic spaces as equal participants. Zoopolis urges us to acknowledge the civic as more than human. It asks us to cultivate the art of attentiveness, to notice and meaningfully respond to the lives and agencies of other species on their own terms, not for our mere use as food, materials, health and entertainment. The ethics of Zoopolis chimes with community-focused research more broadly, with emphasis on co-production, knowledge, asset-based development and participatory design. Community-based research and design aims to empower residents to shape decisions about their environments.
So when we extend this ethos to include non-human lives, we begin to imagine communities as multi-species collectives where power is redistributed and we move beyond tokenistic inclusion towards genuine collaboration. I invite you to imagine what our cities and landscapes could look like if we embraced zoopolis. Co-created futures demands that we expand our design ethics beyond human needs. Civic policy and practices remain largely anthropocentric. They prioritise human narratives, aesthetics, and economic interests, often relegating animals to the margins. Biodiversity becomes a box to tick in environmental assessments, or wider nature is positioned as a way of solving human health problems. Biodiversity net gain or green prescribing reduces other species to functions rather than acknowledging them as persons. Or we're still applying terms like non-native and invasive, shaping public attitudes and justifying control measures against animals. Animals are framed as either pests, intruders, tolerated occupiers, or helpful assistants. Their presence is seen as either a problem to be managed or traits to be exploited. The actions and motivations of animals as heritage and culture makers, as beings who shape and inhabit landscapes, are largely ignored. So here is the provocation. If practice and policy is now better at asking whose human stories matter, why not also ask which species matter? This question unsettles the human-centric assumptions underpinning our civic systems. It demands that we rethink how we research, design, and plan with animals as partners and stakeholders. Anthropocentrism is a barrier to co-created futures. The challenge lies in dismantling entrenched frameworks. A breakthrough may lie in shifting from biodiversity to zoopolis. Biodiversity tells us how many species exist. Zoopolis asks how those species live and participate in shared worlds as part of community. It reframes animals as political subjects with interests deserving recognition, representation, and responsibility, the three principles I propose for a zoopolis-informed design. Recognition means acknowledging animals as co-inhabitants whose lives matter. Representation involves creating mechanisms for their interests to be considered in spatial planning and management through education, advocacy, policy, research, and spatial interventions. Responsibility calls for designing spaces that enable safe movement, nesting, shelter, food foraging, and joy and expression while minimising harm. To operationalise these principles, we need creative interdisciplinary methodologies and lively ethnographies, to quote Thomas van der Ven, a zoopolis way of thinking to shape the doing. I offer a few small local examples of zoopolis shaping my thinking into practice. For example, take the Canada geese in Manchester, which I've written about for the Animal Geographies group at the RGS. Their presence in post-industrial neighbourhoods challenges dominant narratives of urban communities and exposes cultural biases embedded in terms like non-native and invasive. Such terms carry cultural and political baggage, echoing discourses of migration and belonging. Introduced centuries ago, the Canada goose is still labelled as non-native, often vilified in the media as a nuisance. Such narratives shape public attitudes and justify control methods, sidelining ethical questions about coexistence. Residents' interactions with Canada geese reveal complex feelings, annoyance, affection, indifference that defy simplistic categorisations. Through an application of my proposed zoopolis principles into public space, we can consider the Canada goose as a community citizen. Their needs and interests can be supported by, for example, integrating or signposting well-used goose pathways, creating feeding stations, improving canal-side habitats, and discouraging human access to certain areas during the breeding season. This could respect the geese's established presence as well as addressing human ambivalence. This also requires a better understanding of how the geese currently occupy spaces and why, what they are at risk from and what they are at risk to and when, what do geese need in order to be happy and healthy, and what relationships already exist between people and the geese, and uplifting all of this knowledge and experience in community education practice and physical interventions. And then there is Mabel, my canine collaborator and companion, who's a German Shepherd. It's important we work across domesticated captive animals and wild animals, as Kimlicka and Donaldson outline in their theory of zoopolis, as each species has a right to be represented if they have a presence in public and private space. So with Mabel, we are evolving a collaborative creative archive, exploring how domestic animals shape cultural practices and values. Her everyday actions, sniffing, digging, resting, playing, foraging and barking, reveal alternative ways of valuing and creating domestic and public spaces. This collaboration requires me to pay attention to her desires, frustrations, consent and negotiation. As a side point, the broader context to domestic animals is the shocking statistic that there are estimated 2.7 million animals entering UK animal shelters each year. Additionally, there is now a greater attention to issues around invasive conditioning and training of dogs, in particular the pathologising of dog behaviour, domestication as confinement, and the need for veterinary social workers. So if we can't get our care and design practices right for our so-called domestic companions, it doesn't look too hopeful for wild animals. Other more obvious design interventions in urban spaces should and already do include pollinator corridors, hedgehog highways, wildlife inclusive allotments and community gardens, and untidy areas in public parks, all accompanied by local education embedded in schools and neighbourhoods as to why these things can help us build relations. These are not mere add-ons, they represent a shift in design philosophy, from controlling other nature to genuinely cohabiting with it. Such practices also require patience and understanding, as with any community relationship. For example, I have twice had to rebuild a stone wall that a resident badger keeps knocking over when they enter our garden. So I rethought the space and made it easier for the badger to enter at a slightly lower point of the wall. And that seems to be working out okay. The new height of the wall still enables the badger to get in, whilst Mabel, our dog, does not get out. We also have roe deer entering the garden during the apple season. We acknowledge that generations of their families have lived in the area much longer than we have, so we don't put up obstacles in their way to enter and roam. I monitor what they eat and when, etc. So our garden is now part of their edible neighbourhood, and their eating needs sit alongside our own in our little orchard garden. These examples challenge us to see animals not as foes, but as partners in shaping inclusive environments. We need to keep collating and creating examples to show that zoopolis is not an abstract ideal, but a practical framework for action. Multi-species design can be scaled through policy and planning, but it takes a shift in perspective that human needs should not dominate, but coexist. Yeah, it always gets it. So what happens when we adopt zoopolis principles? Ecologically, we foster resilience by genuinely supporting diverse species and their interactions. Socially, we cultivate empathy and shared stewardship, strengthening community bonds across humans and other animals. Politically, we advance justice by recognising animals as stakeholders in civic life. And this is more than a design tweak, it's a paradigm shift. It redefines what we mean by sustainability, heritage, place and community. It aligns with global movements for environmental justice and animal ethics. Zoopolis also requires our tolerance of those things and beings and their bodily traces and activities that we have sometimes been quick to extinguish and exclude. Imagine cities where green spaces double as multi-species commons, where planning processes include animal advocates, where heritage narratives celebrate interspecies histories and cultures. These futures are possible if we commit to rethinking our frameworks and practices. The impact of embedding zoopolis principles into community-focused research could be profound. For practitioners, the call to action is clear. Start small. Install bird boxes, create wild gardens and parks, map animal movements and practices, design those hedgehog highways, and advocate for multi-species planning charters and represent animals' interests in those consultations. These acts signal a commitment to collaboration across species. There's a shift in values from domination to coexistence. So what about integrating zoopolis, animal citizenship, into our urban planning and practices? Well, we kind of have three options, I suppose. So option A is the status quo, which is metric-focused biodiversity and ad hoc mitigation and adaptation. Option B, enhanced biodiversity standards, so net gain and habitat protections. Or option C, zoopolis integration, so principles of recognition, representation, and responsibility across all local authority departments. So these are my recommendations. So embed zoopolis principles in local plans, design codes and cultural guidance. Mandate multi-species impact assessments for major schemes, so transport, housing and regeneration. Fund community-led pilots. Establish representation mechanisms, so include animal advocates in consultations and advisory boards. Create and publish open data and multi-species metrics across connectivity, species usage, incident reduction and public sentiment. So my key takeaways. Shift from metrics to ethics. Biodiversity is a justice issue. Operationalise zoopolis at a regional level via recognition, representation and responsibility. Community-led multi-species pilots deliver high-value outcomes at low cost. Measure what matters, connectivity, usage, sentiment, incidents and practices. And embed animal behaviour, care, welfare training and education into community and mainstream learning. So to end then, community-focused research reminds us that futures are not given, they are made through relationships, negotiations and shared responsibilities. When we design with animals, we design for justice. This is the essence of co-created futures, worlds where humans and non-humans thrive together, bound by mutual care and attentiveness. Thank you.
Around reconciling and bringing together kind of diverse perspectives, whether it's kind of community knowledge, whether it's looking at kind of interactions with the private sector, whether it's looking at interactions between people and animals. What kind of approaches have you found that kind of make those changes work and stick in practice? And what are the big kind of challenges to overcome if we want to kind of scale those kind of more inclusive approaches to nature policy and governance?
Good question. That was my first mistake. So, what have I found? That microplastics research kind of just over the last few years has taken my career in a very different direction to I intended. So I almost became part activist and started having conversations with groups that I hadn't had conversations with before. But I think what has been most productive, I think, is conversations with other activists, but also conversations with policymakers, and helping to shape policy, whether it's through designing monitoring networks or whether it's policy in relation to how policymakers deal with illegal discharges into the environment, for example. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's been a challenging kind of me having a kind of total really new mindset for how I do my research and the implications of that research, building impacts, etc. To use the sort of university parlance. But I'm also encouraged by, I do have a lot of interaction with some of those groups that I mentioned who've been campaigning against river pollution, water quality, principally sewage discharge. It obviously comes through the lens of that, but it's a whole range of other pollutants as well. But I found those conversations really uplifting, really helpful, really sort of life enhancing, and I'm optimistic about the future because I see that those groups who are making the most noise and who are campaigning most effectively are very often attracting a lot of investment. So there is a positive outcome from being active, and I think that's a positive output from this, and those are the conversations that I think I've found most fruitful. I've had some challenging conversations with others that I mentioned in my talk, but maybe this isn't the place to explore those.
Come on, Jamie.
Why not?
I think on the issue of scalability, I think as academics we'd all like to collate the perfect global data set where we come up with a panacea solution to everything that gets published in Science or Nature. But the reality of doing locally relevant co-production is that not everything is scalable, not everything is global. Yes, there are global challenges, there are things like global networks of satellites, and some things do have to be done at that scale. But a lot of issues are local. The people who are being impacted by some of those things have locally specific needs, locally specific capacities, and sometimes you actually do just need to get all of the people in a particular place together and find what works for that place. And I think that the urge to try and make one size fit all is not actually necessarily a good approach to co-created futures, because we can't actually co-create a future with, 8 billion people in one room. So sometimes you just have to make a smaller room with less people in it, but make sure that those people actually do all get to have a say.
Yeah, cool. So, can I just have a hand? Who's from Salk here? Yeah, okay. One, yeah. So this is part of the problem, right, in terms of thinking about interdisciplinarity and different ways of making community. So I think so I come from an arts and design background, and there's a lot of other people who could feed into this conversation thinking about, different ways of working within and through communities that kind of comes out of community practice, but also has different kinds of methods that cut across some of these really big challenges. And another plug for the platform, Creative Manchester, if you want to go have a look at that. But so I think, so some of the stuff that I presented today, thinking about how do we collaborate with animals when there is that, a natural language kind of barrier. I think actually there's been some really exciting work that's being done, but it's coming out of arts. So I think, this is where we have to sort of maybe join the dots even more across our disciplines and across different ways of practicing and doing and thinking about what might be traditionally considered science subjects, but actually, I come from the angle that actually all of this is a cultural issue. This is not a scientific problem that we're dealing with in terms of sustainability, it's a cultural issue. So we need more cultural analysts in the room, and I think we've listened to them today. So, which isn't your fault, they should be here. But it's a two-way thing, right? So arts and cultural analysts need to also recognise they've got responsibility to be in the room as part of these conversations. So,
I think you had two questions up there.
My question's for Dr. Woodward. When you were talking about integrating microplastics management into the current wastewater treatment systems, I've read some work about the use of wetland habitats to sort of filter microplastics from entering into riverbeds as sort of a external addition to the wastewater treatment system, which offers sort of a more cost-effective, immediate remedy to it. What is the feasibility of such wetland systems like filtration ponds attached to urban discharge zones or wastewater discharge zones or mud flats also in Manchester?
Well, those microplastics would still be in the environment, in a wetland. You'd be trapping microplastics in a wetland environment. This is a wicked problem. What existing wastewater treatment technologies is capable of removing the vast majority of the microplastics without any special additional filtration. Tertiary treatment will do that. I'm not sure that some of those nature-based solutions are a strategy, but what happens then is that those microplastics end up in sewage sludge. What do we do with sewage sludge? We spread it on agricultural land. So we put the microplastics back in the environment anyway. But I would argue that that's actually a better strategy. It's not an ideal strategy. That's a better strategy than discharging wastewater directly into ecologically sensitive riverbeds, particularly at times of year when they're going to be sensitive to those pollutants. So there are no easy solutions to this. The ultimate solution is to reduce the amount of plastic waste that we produce. That isn't going to happen anytime soon, so I think conventional wastewater treatment has to be part of the process. I'm not sure wetlands can remove heavy metals and other things, but trapping microplastics, you're still trapping microplastics in the environment that then could subsequently be eroded by laterally moving river channel, for example, and end up back in the river. So, yeah, I think conventional treatment has to be part of the solution. Does that answer your question? Thank you. And we also, around Greater Manchester, we're really stuck for space as well in many of these places as well.
Hi, my question's for Dr. Ashton. So kind of building on that idea of lack of space, I think my question's coming kind of from a perspective maybe from a global south, when we're talking about rapid urbanization and we're seeing humans encroach on animals, land, for example. How would you kind of, like from an ethical or maybe your this personal perspective, how would you kind of alter the zoopolis framework to kind of deal with, let's say, the poorest in society or the least economically advantaged people kind of being pushed to the urban peripheries, and then also having to deal with, you know, local like predators, like for example, like leopards coming into villages? How would you kind of adjust that framework?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of the global south, one of the things that a lot of folks in the global north don't realise is that the majority of dogs are actually free roaming dogs. Like 75% of the world's dogs are actually free roaming, and they're in the majority in the global south, in the majority. So I think a lot of the interesting philosophical conversations around how we coexist with animals is actually coming out of the global south. That's actually where the conversation, I mean, you know, yeah, Donaldson and Kimlicka, you know, published their book a while ago, so I'm using it as a framework, but actually the more recent animal ethics conversations and anthrozoological kind of conversations are actually coming out of this global south exactly around this. Partly informed by indigenous frameworks, but also recognising that the issue, like you said, about the urban, you know, urban poor, urban poverty has not been caused by animals, it's been caused by extractive capitalism, which exploits people and animals. So I think people are starting to realise that actually it's not a kind of them and us between animals and other animals and humans. It's actually, hang on, it's the wider system, which of course is everything we've been talking about today, right? But yeah, so I mean, I'm not going to speak on behalf of people that live in the global south, but I would say go into that scholarship, because actually it's really rich and really interesting, and there's been some really amazing researchers working in India, particularly around free roaming dogs, and thinking about the kinds of relationships that actually evolve, and actually what we should learn from that in global north contexts, where we are seemingly actually increasing our abandonment of our so-called companion animals, and that's my kind of starting point in ways. If we can't even treat our companion animals correctly, then I'm very nervous about how we're treating other wild animals. So, but the issue about the geese, that comes out of a particular, some work I've been doing over the last few years in East Manchester, and the kind of relations that are happening between the geese and residents and communities who live right up along the canal. And obviously those estates have evolved along the canal because of sort of post-industrial redevelopment and so on, so that's kind of part of the case study, which I just touched on a little bit today, so yeah.
If you mind, I might sort of jump in here. I'm not an expert on this by any means, but one of the things that we've been talking about in our Kenya case study is that there's a lot of efforts towards implementing fortress conservation activities in the Mount Kenya region, where people are building fenced private conservancies to try and keep a rhino or a group of elephants in one place and protect it, which seems like a great conservation outcome. But what's happening is that we're deciding where those elephants and rhinos are going to be. We're deciding, hey, this is going to be a really great place for a migration corridor. So we're going to build fences and force elephants to follow this track to get from this habitat to this habitat. And that's not where the elephants want to go. They get mad about it. They break down fences. They wander into villages and they kill people. So the human-wildlife conflict that's happening in these communities is our problem. People have been living in that landscape for ages and have learned how to coexist with elephants, and it's when Western conservation organisations have gone in and decided that they have a better idea about where elephants should be migrating than the elephants do, that those problems happen. So a better approach, in my opinion, to elephant conservation and to developing migration corridors
would be to ask the elephants where they want to go and then letting them do that and working around them instead of trying to force nature to fit into our perception of a neat and orderly society.
And that's the challenge back to us, all communities and planners and all the rest of it. It's kind of actually us letting go of control of it, or going, oh, actually, we've got to redesign things. Actually, it can't remain in this way, you know. And yeah, that's the paradigm shift. That's the kind of cognitive dissonance that kicks in around this stuff. So yeah.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. My question is to Dr. Janelle Ashton. If Zoopolis treats animals as equal and, you know, kind of political, you know, kind of equals and agents in decision making, what does consent realistically look like, so that, you know, kind of we don't claim to represent the agency of the animals without, you know, kind of collapsing their behavior into whatever humans think is possible or should be. So you might have, you know, mentioned it in your talk, but I would love it if you just kind of clarified it a bit.
Yeah, sure. So there's I can't remember the name of the author now, but there's a brilliant book called Consent, and it's working with canine companions, and it's I'll find the name of it in the break. And she's talking through actually that. So she comes from an animal behaviour background, the researcher, and she's spent quite a long time thinking about actually what does consent mean when working with dogs, and kind of working through ethological, I'm not sure you pronounce that, ethological lenses to kind of use animal behaviour, you know, traditional animal behaviour study as a starting point, and then shift and reframe in terms of other kinds of justice questions that we would be asking in terms of other kinds of community practice when it comes to consent. And I think all of this is, and there's also been some other, kind of interesting work being done by behaviourist and applied ethologist Kim Brophy as well in this space. Again, expanding the idea of you know, how canine companions in particular are part of our environments in that kind of collective consent way, and to acknowledge that they are captive, and even that is quite, you know, a provocation to a lot of people that actually, you know, dogs in our homes are captive animals, and that's the starting point for the conversation. So there are lots of things I think starting to happen to explore this issue of consent, but I think it is a challenge because of language barriers. But I think we can also look to really interesting practice that's happened in community practice and go, right, what have we learned from really in-depth collaborative community practice within humans, and then how do we you know, explore those frameworks and what is transferable or not, and kind of being honest as well about, like, where the limitations are on some of this. I mean, that was the pushback against Kim Licker and Olson's work, was, you know, how do you get around the co-citizen? How could they be co-citizens? You know, so this is the pushback on that work, but I think it's worth still trying, right?
There's a question at the back, and then there's a one in the middle there.
Hi, my name is Anya. My question is to Professor Woodward. I've had research experience on endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I was wondering if mapping for some EDCs could potentially follow microplastics, and if you think an equal attention to the pollution of EDCs should also be raised to the governmental initiative level.
Sorry, what were EDCs again?
Endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Oh, of course, I didn't hear that.
We don't have good data on what's in our rivers. You know, microplastics is a big deal, forever chemicals. You know, there's a whole range of parameters that we know are out there, and some university departments are doing really interesting work on a local scale. But we don't have good national data on what's in our river water in terms of contaminants. So good quality metrics, good quality data, absolutely essential. When I've given this talk before, people have asked me about data sets. I mean, a lot of my former students work for the Environment Agency, who are responsible for collecting data on river water quality, and there's lots of fantastic professionals who care passionately about the environment there. But can we get political now? When Liz Truss was at DEFRA in 2014-15, she slashed their monitoring budget in half. and some of that money's been put back in very recently, but they haven't recovered from that. So basically, they've lost their capacity to monitor, first of all, what the water companies are doing, but also lost the capacity to monitor what the state of our rivers were in many cases. So good data are absolutely essential, whatever the parameter you're interested in.
I have another question for you about microplastics. It was great to see how you were sampling and measuring microplastics. My understanding is the smaller the microplastic gets, the worse the potential toxicity effects can be. I was just wondering what the sort of resolution what's the cutoff in terms of the smaller size you were measuring, and do you think there's sort of a chunk of that story being missed in terms of smaller sizes that might have?
It's a really good question. So the way we started doing this is that we can physically pick up the microplastics with very fine tweezers, and we can pick them up and analyse them and study them. So the resolution we can go down to is about 60 microns. So there are 1,000 microns in a millimetre. So the end of your ballpoint pen is about 1,000 microns. So split that in half, 500 microns, half a millimetre. So most of the microplastics we look at are between about 500 and 60 microns. So yes, there are microplastics much smaller than that. There's some really interesting work going on now on nanoplastics, which is smaller than a single micron. There are technical challenges for sampling and measuring those, but the smaller those plastics get, the more mobile they are around your body, for example. They can move through the cell wall, move through the bloodstream. So yeah, that's the kind of new frontier in microplastics research, is looking at really small stuff. But we found in the rivers around here that the size range we were looking at was actually, they settled out in the riverbed, and they were perfect size actually, because they're sort of sand-sized, if you like, and these rivers are very sandy, but they were the ideal size to identify, let's call it poor wastewater behaviour.
I wonder if, Jamie's kind of touched on some of the kind of technical regulatory challenges around kind of monitoring of water quality there. I wonder if Sarah or Jenny, you want to kind of touch on any of the sort of challenges around how you actually represent kind of more diverse values and perspectives within biodiversity monitoring, because we do continually talk about kind of data and monitoring as being kind of integral to responding to the biodiversity crisis.
Well, I suggested some, in my talk, I guess. So yes, this idea of representation, I suppose it's ensuring, from my perspective anyway, if I'm thinking about animals and how they exist as sort of co-heritage makers and actually culture makers, it's just ensuring that actually, first of all, they are taken seriously as I'll use the word citizen for now, as citizens in decision making, and I think, well, like I said in the presentation, often they're relegated to being kind of counted, as it were, but the kind of broader questions around ethics, or how they live, or how animals actually, deserve to be in the world, regardless of their usefulness or not to us. And that's the thing. I suppose that's the thing that I'm a bit concerned about at the moment, is that I'm hearing a lot, obviously, when it's to do with funding, hearing a lot about the benefits of nature for human health. I'm hearing that all the time at the moment. Like, there's several reports coming out every week, almost, it feels, which is great. But could we also talk about the benefits of nature for nature, or wider nature for itself? So it's then ensuring that is represented really strongly, and different disciplines can bring different modes of representation to the table. I guess, so you might have a data set, which is really important because it does actually do that kind of number crunching, but also, kind of ethnographies and different forms of creative representation or storytelling. Actual kind of case studies of living and working and getting to know different individuals as much as collectives and collections of species. So I just think we've got to be advocates in different ways and find ways of being advocates through different modes of data.
I think that sort of as a society, we have hierarchies of what we consider to be appropriate evidence to use to make decisions. And the way that we're taught in school, in university,
is that we should prioritize quantitative, like random sampling, backy designs, all of this stuff that gives you the best empirical knowledge. And sure, we need good data, and there are some things which, like, generally it is easier and most efficient to capture with some kind of quantitative analysis. But there are concepts that are really difficult to reduce down to numbers, and when you reduce them down to numbers, you lose nuance, you lose meaning. And so I think that as a society, we need to start to really reckon with how we better integrate different ways of knowing, and particularly different types of data, into our monitoring and evaluation. I'm a mixed methods researcher. If I spend too much time analysing interviews and texts, I'm like, oh, someone give me some numbers, I need some objectivity. And then if I spend too much time doing maths, I'm like, oh, this is not capturing the nuance, I need someone to sit down and do some qualitative analysis. And I really think that mixed methods research is the future, and we need to get better at understanding qualitative work. So I've been doing, my background is in fisheries science, and I've been doing some work for the UK government lately on trying to redo how we manage fisheries in the UK. And they'll do things like hire us to create a database of all of the different information around the resilience of fishers and fishing communities in the UK. We'll start by collating all of the quantitative data because it's easy, and then we're like, oh yeah, there's also some qualitative data, but it takes 2 hours to analyse one interview. And they're like, oh, we don't have time, we don't have the money, so it doesn't happen, and so the policy gets written based on quantitative data, and that nuance is just completely lost. And so I think that we need to work with policymakers to try to reframe what data we consider valuable, and actually put the time and resourcing into using different kinds of data. And also we need to train students on different types of data analysis and teach people to value different types of information, so that when they end up working in the university, in research, in government themselves, they don't have those same biases that I think we sort of were trained into.
Can I just say something quickly about sewage? I don't know how many of you lie awake at night thinking about how sewage is measured and the metrics, but it's really important. I think you should. So you may remember that I mentioned that the water companies have been given a target now. They've got to reduce the number of sewage spills by 50% by the end of the decade. So at the moment we have data on the number of hours that sewage is discharged for. Okay, so that's duration, and we have the number of spills. So that's each time a spill event happens. I mentioned to the government that we should ask the water companies to give us data on volume, and other experts did the same. But the water companies lobbied hard for the metric of spills. So in theory, you can reduce the number of sewage spills, the number of sewage occurrences, but you could increase the volume of those discharges. So the quality of the metrics is really important if you're going to measure any industry improvement or change with confidence. And water companies follow targets that the regulators set. So if you wanted to invest, you target, well, let's go for the River Tame, where we've got some small wastewater treatment plants, we can reduce those spills significantly. I'm a cynic, okay, I'm sceptical, but I'm just putting it out there. Theoretically, you can reduce the number of spills and actually not significantly reduce the volume. The volume is likely to come down, but the point is you need really good, reliable, robust metrics.
We might have time for one more quick question, if anyone has something that is relatively brief.
Last one again?
Yeah?
Yeah. Thank you. My question's for Dr. Sutcliffe. So with remote sensing, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. So with remote sensing, can you tell me about the potential to advance cumulative impact, risk, and environmental assessment, and how that advancement would increase the expectations of what's considered best practice in risk and impact assessment?
Tim, you might actually be better for answering that question than me.
Thanks, that's not the easiest question to answer. I mean, I think the big benefit of, say, remote sensing and satellite data is it allows you to collect lots of data over large spatial areas in a way that isn't really possible if you were doing, like, say, a traditional sort of on-the-ground field survey. But I think, as has been highlighted, the danger is that that's an approximation of what's actually happening on the ground, and there's lots of stuff you're not seeing and lots of nuance you're not picking up from solely relying on that data. And I think to kind of get to the point that Jamie was talking about, it creates scenarios where the metrics that are generated out of those data can be quite easily gamed and manipulated in ways that may potentially disadvantage quite significantly local communities. And if you're talking about kind of environmental risk assessment, that's often something where there's a history of doing that in lots of, particularly in global south context. So I think, yeah, there probably is a need to avoid the tendency for those kinds of data to potentially be used to legitimize decisions in a way that might be harder to do if there was also some kind of local contextual knowledge being fed in as well. All right. Well, firstly, thank you to all the speakers, and yeah, I think we have a wrap up now before the drinks reception.